History as it happens, April 8th, 2021. Filibuster.
I will say standing here after 14 hours, standing on your own feet, there's sometimes some pain, sometimes some fatigue that is involved. But you know what? There's far more pain involved in rolling over.
From procedural accident to tool of partisan warfare, the filibusters become a source of frustration, a symbol of obstruction for Republicans and Democrats alike. But now, as some Democrats consider ending it, the filibusters' defenders are warning things will only get worse without it. That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Nobody serving in this chamber can even begin to imagine what a completely scorched earth Senate would look like.
The framers, particularly Alexander Hamilton, were warning against requiring supermajorities for almost anything. I mean, they thought that supermajorities were a bad idea.
I bet you've never heard of Narciso Lopez. He was a filibusterer, or maybe we should call him a filibustero, and not in the U.S. Senate. He led 3 expeditions to annex Cuba for the United States. No joke. The last occurred in 1851, and it did not end well for Lopez or the American mercenaries who went along with him. I bet you have heard of Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, a more recent filibusterer of sorts.
I intend to speak in support of defunding Obamacare until I am no longer able to stand.
And that 21-hour speech in 2013 was technically not a filibuster, nor did it succeed in its purpose of defunding Obamacare, but it has become part of the filibuster's long and inglorious history as a tool of bare-knuckle partisan warfare. And it began as an accident.
What happened was, in 1805, then Vice President Aaron Burr, who was under indictment actually for murder, having shot Alexander Hamilton a year earlier, he gave a final farewell speech to the Senate.
And that's Princeton historian Sean Wilentz. He's back. We're going to talk about where the filibuster comes from and the arguments for and against keeping it. Sean will join us in a moment. So we already know what the partisan arguments are. Right now, some Democrats see an opportunity to pass major pieces of legislation on health care, immigration reform, voting rights. All of them could be blocked by Republicans unless the filibuster is changed or eliminated, the argument goes. Fact is, members of both parties have argued for and against maintaining the filibuster, depending on whose side has the majority at any given time. Just take Barack Obama, first as a senator arguing against weakening it, then as president changing his mind, and then as an ex-president saying, why not just get rid of it altogether?
If the right of free and open debate is taken away from the minority party and the millions of Americans who ask us to be their voice, I fear that the already partisan atmosphere in Washington will be poisoned to the point where no one will be able to agree on anything.
I realize that neither party has been blameless for these tactics. They've developed over years, and it seems as if they've continually escalated. But today's pattern of obstruction, it just isn't normal.
And if all this takes eliminating the filibuster, another Jim Crow relic, in order to secure the God-given rights of every American, then that's what we should do.
There's little doubt he was thinking of all the times the filibuster was used to block civil rights bills. Senator Strom Thurmond in 1957, he set the all-time record more than 24 hours on the Senate floor trying to block the Civil Rights Act of that year. Strom Thurmond, the old Dixiecrat.
That it's another effort on the part of the president to dominate the country by force and to put into effect these uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights.
That was Strom at the Dixiecrat Convention in 1948, comparing federal civil rights bills to totalitarianism. So the filibuster has been weakened recently. In 2013, Senate Democrats eliminated its use on all presidential nominees except for the Supreme Court. In 2017, Republicans were back in charge in the Senate. They eliminated the use of the filibuster on the Supreme Court. That explains why Democrats were helpless to stop the confirmations of Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. So what about simply getting rid of this thing and going back to majority rule, up or down votes? Not that easy, says Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
Everything that Democrat Senates did to Presidents Bush and Trump, everything the Republican Senate did to President Obama, would be child's play compared to the disaster that Democrats would create for their own priorities if they break the Senate.
Well, as you can gather by now, the filibuster has been added to the long list of issues over which R's and D's are bitterly divided. No Republican supports ending the filibuster. 2 Democrats have expressed misgivings. That's Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. Is the filibuster really so sacred? Our guest today says absolutely not. And that would be one of the preeminent scholars and public intellectuals in our country, the author of The Rise of American Democracy. Sean Wilentz, great to have you back.
Great to be here.
When we had you on a few weeks ago, we were talking about the future of the Republican Party, and we mentioned that we would have you back at some point to talk about the Democrats. But today we're going to talk about something that's important to both parties, the filibuster. You just wrote an essay in Rolling Stone saying the filibuster is no cornerstone of senatorial greatness. It's an accident that has spun out of control. So before we get to the issue of whether the filibuster should stay or go, it sounds like you're saying that at least at first, we should stop idealizing its history.
Yeah, I mean, it's an accident, as you said. In the Constitution, there's certainly no filibuster put into the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States establishes the Senate and the House. And at the time, the framers, particularly Alexander Hamilton, were warning against requiring supermajorities for almost anything. I mean, they thought that supermajorities were a bad idea. But this hasn't even occurred to anybody at this point. The rules were made in the House and Senate. There were rules established whereby debate on any particular issue could be halted. You couldn't just keep debate going on and on and on forever. There was this rule that was established in both the House and the Senate to cut off debate. That rule still exists in the House of Representatives. That's why you don't have filibusters in the House. People wonder why there are no filibusters in the House. It's because the rule that was established in 1789 still is in force, basically. Basically, it's still in force. The Senate's a different matter. And it was completely by accident that the filibusters, as we know it, came into existence in a sort of negative way. What happened was, in 1805, then Vice President Aaron Burr, who was under indictment actually for murder, having shot Alexander Hamilton a year earlier, he gave a final farewell speech to the Senate. And it was a brilliant speech in many ways, a very moving speech. And he was talking about the old days and all the things that he learned in serving the Republic, et cetera, et cetera. Total scoundrel in many ways, Burr was, but it was a great speech. In that speech, he happened to reflect on his time as vice president, as the president of the Senate, things that could be changed about the Senate. And he said, you've got too many rules here, too many, redundant rules. Let's just you should clean up your act and get rid of some of these rules. Well, one of the rules that he pointed to was the rule that allowed you to cut off debate. He had no particular reason for doing so. He just wanted it was housekeeping, right? He wanted to have cleaner set of rules, right? And he thought that since this rule hadn't been used very much, fine, well, let's just get rid of it. So they did. What that meant was there was no way to cut off debate. And while it took a while before people caught on to what the possibilities of this were, by the 1840s and 50s, all sorts of people are slowing down and then, in fact, stopping legislation in the Senate because it was unlimited. There was no basis for ending any debate. It all started there, and it started because of an accident by Aaron Burr more than anything else.
And we'll get into the evolution of the filibuster into the 1840s and 50s and beyond. But first, I'd like to start with the origin of the term. It comes from a Spanish word, filibustero. The original filibusterers were Americans who went on these expeditions to invade places like Cuba, to annex them, to make them slave states, right?
That's right. I mean, in the 1850s, there were a bunch of adventurers who had hooked up with various Cuban nationalists to try and wrench Cuba away from the Spanish Empire and to establish it as an independent state, and then with the idea eventually of annexing it and making it one of the United States. A man named John Quitman, who was, I believe, governor or senator, he's from Mississippi, was behind a lot of this. They conscripted a guy named Narciso Lopez to try to lead these expeditions, as you say. It was quasi-military. It wasn't supported by the U.S. government formally, but these were, people who were well-connected. And they were looking, to push American expansion southward rather than westward, right? Instead of moving out towards California, which they had accomplished in 1848 with the Mexican War, they were going to push southward into the Caribbean. And, there were only three at this point, or pretty much only three great slave societies left in the Western Hemisphere, that of Brazil, Cuba, and the southern states of the southern portion of the United States. So it seemed normal to these guys to say, well, on to Cuba. These expeditions were set up, and they got the name, as you say, filibustero, which is Spanish for pirate. And these guys were considered pirates. The word filibuster was attached to the Senate in question because basically what senators who were filibuster or were holding the Senate hostage were, in a sense, acting as pirates. They were stealing the debate. They were hijacking the debate, so that the word was applied from one to the other.
And we should note that some of these filibusters met violent ends. You wrote in your book, The Rise of American Democracy, about William Walker in 1855. He went off to Nicaragua. He toppled the government there, opened it up to pro-slavery Southerners. He was executed by firing squad. And I believe in Cuba, 50 American mercenaries were executed as well for invading. Did not end well.
It did not end well. Narciso Lopez, who was the front man in Cuba for the American expeditions, he ended up getting garroted in a public space, I think even in a stadium in Havana, in front of cheering thousands of people who were very happy to see him die.
Well, nothing like that will happen on the floor of the Senate, we hope. So,
well, in those days, things can get violent on the floor of the Senate in the 1850s. South Carolina senator named James Hammond, a famous guy, said that the only senators who weren't carrying a pistol into the U.S. Senate were carrying a knife and a pistol into the U.S. Senate.
Well, I guess I shouldn't talk given what happened on January 6th, but not to digress there. So the filibuster as a parliamentary tactic in the 1840s and 50s and on into the 20th century. Sean, I'll just set you up and you can give us an overview, if you'd like, of how the filibuster evolved to what it is today, where you don't even have to give a speech on the Senate floor to obstruct legislation. Before now, the filibuster was used infrequently, but it was used at key moments, right?
Well, more and more it was being used in the 19th century. I mean, not much before the Civil War. There were occasions in that piece I mentioned one where, a guy told Henry Clay that he was going to filibuster, that he might as well, this was in the summer, he might as well make his arrangements for the entire winter because he was going to stay on the floor of the Senate for that long. It became more in use after the Civil War, to the point where leaders of both parties wanted to get rid of it. I mean, it's not as if this is the first time that we're considering the possibility of getting rid of the filibuster. Both parties were finding themselves frustrated by it all through the late 19th century. The reason it wasn't gotten rid of is because they'd bring it up, and then the people who were in favor of the filibuster would filibuster, and they keep it from getting passed through the Senate. So it was not, it just wasn't done. In 1917, that was the first big change in the lead up to World War I. There was a bill before the Senate. I won't go into details, but it was something that the president wanted, Woodrow Wilson. But it was being filibustered in the Senate. And as a part of an agreement, they worked out a system whereby if you got 2/3 of the Senate to agree to close debate, then debate would be closed. It was the so-called Cloture Movement. And the idea of being able to invoke cloture, that begins in 1917. It's later refined. All of the rules regarding the filibuster are refined over time. It's now at the point where it requires 60%, that is to say now 60 senators are necessary to invoke cloture, which is mean to finally end debate. But it's still a supermajority. If the majority is 50, then it's the majority plus 10, which is what it is today. That's the history of it. It was, as I say, it began as an accident. It turned into something that spun out of control. Senators have been trying to get their arms around this for more than a century to try to figure out what to do with this, monstrous thing that came out of nowhere. What's happened recently, though, Martin, as you said before, is even more interesting. Back in the day, in the 1930s, 40s, into the 1950s, the filibuster became a particularly favored tool for Southern segregationists in the Senate to try to block any kind of civil rights bill, anti-lynching bills, right through to Lyndon Johnson's, civil rights bill of 1964.
You're reading my mind, because I was going to ask you about one of those arguments being made today to get rid of the filibuster, that it's a relic of Jim Crow.
The filibuster became particularly notorious in the hands of Southern segregationists. It wasn't the only use of the filibuster by any means, but in the 1940s, 50s, right through to Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which was the last, really great stand by the Southern segregationists in his own party to try and block civil rights legislation. That's where it gained its notoriety, right? And it was very successful for a very long time in either blocking altogether or in watering down civil rights legislation. But to achieve that, senators would have to hold the floor. That was still the necessity. You couldn't just, say you were going to filibuster. You had to filibuster. You had to be there. You had to stand. And, there's a world record. I forget who holds it. It's the longest, or the United States record, which is the world record for a filibuster. It was either Strom Thurmond. It was one of them, one of the Southerners, who held the floor of the Senate for, many, many, many hours, refusing to drink any water because, you didn't want to have to take a bathroom break, that kind of thing. More recently, though, it's become much easier to have a filibuster because you don't have to actually stand there. To achieve a filibuster now, all you have to do is send an email to the majority leader, saying that you want to filibuster this particular bill. You don't have to get up, you don't have to stand, you don't have to do a blessed thing. It's become a kind of automatic process. There have been also efforts, though, to make it harder to filibuster. These two things have been going on kind of at the same time. In recent memory, the Senate has carved out particular kinds of decisions where the filibuster won't adhere. Federal appointments to the executive branch. You cannot filibuster, say, if you don't like somebody who's going to be, named to the cabinet, a Senate filibuster is not going to happen because it's been carved out as something you can't filibuster on. So while they've been making it harder at one level, they've been making it easier at another level. Look, it's a weapon of partisan warfare, right? If you don't have a majority and you want to stop something, but you have enough people to prevent cloture, then you can hold things up. And one party has done it and both parties have done it. It's not a strictly partisan thing.
It seems to have been used a lot more in recent decades than ever before.
It's taken off in recent decades. If you look at the chart of cloture motions, which are a rough surrogate for filibuster threats or filibusters, it's gone crazy in the last 10 to 15 years. Things are more polarized. Politics are more polarized. The splits in the Senate are not what they were. You don't have 60 senators on one side or another. Sometimes, I remember Senator Cruz reading from Dr. Seuss, right?
I do so like green eggs and ham. Thank you, Sam I am.
They'll actually get up and actually do an old-fashioned filibuster because it looks good on TV, I imagine. But you don't have to do that.
As I listen to your remarks, Sean, I'm wondering if the filibuster has ever had or could have any real positive purpose.
Well, the argument you'll hear, and you hear this actually from Senator Manchin, the Democrat who's most opposed to getting rid of the filibuster. The ostensible reason is that you ought to try to have more bipartisan support for any major piece of legislation, right? That it's not enough to have simply the majority get its way every time, that, the majority ought to respect the wishes or the desires, et cetera, of the minority. I guess that's sort of true in normal times. Look, go back to 1964, the Democrats had the majority in the Senate, but the Democrats were the people who were opposing the Civil Rights Bill. Southern Democrats were. So it required a great deal of bipartisan support. Everett Dirksen, the famous Illinois Republican, stood up in favor of the Civil Rights Bill. That's what got it through. It was a bipartisan effort. There's a certain argument to be made that the filibuster helps force majorities to be more bipartisan. The problem comes in a situation as you have today, where the parties are not just polarized, but, in my view, one party has ceased to be a normal party. And insofar as you have legislation pending that is going to allow the abnormalities of the system only get worse. And the abnormalities have basically to do with voting rights, in my view. Now, we can argue about voting rights back and forth. I suppose I take the stand of Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola on this issue. The filibuster is still in place. The voting rights stuff isn't going to get through. And that's going to allow Republican state legislatures to basically ensure that they're going to remain in power forever. That's not democracy, it seems to me.
Good segue to talk about the present moment and your recent essay in Rolling Stone, in which you write, one reason why the Democrats may want to get rid of the filibuster now is so they can pass their voting rights legislation. So your argument is both historical and political.
Sure.
You're saying that if Democrats want to act with some urgency here, before the midterm elections in which they may lose the House and Senate, they need to dump the filibuster now and enact their legislation.
Absolutely. But I think it's because of the nature of the programs we're talking about, in particular with regard to voting rights. Look, if you could work out a solution, if I were in charge of everything and I could work out a solution, I might extend the exceptions of the certain kinds of rules, certain kinds of bills that would be exempt from the filibuster. And one of those would be voting rights. I think voting rights goes to the core of American democracy. To me, the argument that voting ought to be made harder is a transparent partisan ploy. It's trying to keep certain people from voting. In the Rolling Stone piece you cited, Martin, I actually called it Jim Crow 2.0. And I really think that is the case, that there's an attempt being made. It's not just trying to secure a voting system which is not broken by all accounts. There's no evidence for it, quite the opposite. But it's very clearly directed at Black voters and at young voters and at people who tend to vote Democratic. You don't have the grandfather clause anymore. You don't have the poll tax anymore. You have the voter ID laws and stuff. Now, there's another case to be made that the way to combat that is to simply give everybody an ID, to try to figure out how to get around the system that way. And that's another way to deal with it. But I think we're in an emergency situation right now. If you could find a way to exempt those particular laws from the filibuster and get a majority of the Senate to go ahead and do that, a lot of the problems that we're facing would be overcome. It wouldn't necessarily have to be for everything, but it would be at least for that.
Well, one argument being made now against getting rid of the filibuster is that Democrats, once the shoe is on the other foot, will rue the day they did so, if in fact they go ahead and do it, because they won't be able to stop any Republican legislation once the GOP is back in the majority. But going back to your initial remarks, your first answer about majority rule at the founding of the country, I guess in 1789, 14 senators out of 26 would have been a majority. One can easily say that type of situation forces bipartisan negotiation because each side knows it can't stop the other without a filibuster.
No, I agree. Look, majority is a majority. I think it was Senator Sinema, one of the people who have expressed disquiet, Democrats who expressed disquiet about getting rid of the filibuster, have said, the filibuster prevents the majority from having too much power. I don't get it. The majority has no more power without the filibuster than it has by dint of being the majority. Majorities, basically do rule. And the filibuster doesn't encourage, as you were saying, doesn't encourage bipartisanship. And if anything, it's only feeding the polarization of the parties that we have now. So we have this kind of assured mutual destruction, right? You're not going to get rid of the filibuster because if we take the majority, we'll kill you. Well, that's not a way to run American democracy, it seems to me. It's going to be a tough thing to challenge. It's been, it does go back to 1805. It's been around for a long time. Even though it's an accident that's taken root. But I do think it's time to stop thinking that this is some sort of noble, wonderful thing.
And the arguments for keeping the filibuster seem to be based on this premise that Democrats will always vote one way and Republicans will always vote the other on every key piece of legislation.
It's by no means guaranteed, right, that every member of a party is necessarily going to go along with the party. You're going to have to find people who are across the aisle. You're going to have to do that because there are going to be some cases where it's not, there's no unanimity.
That's politics, right? I mean, there's supposed to be some compromise going on here. It's not supposed to be a zero-sum game. But as you wrote in your Rolling Stone essay, and as we discussed the first time we had you on the podcast talking about the future of the Republican Party, your argument is the Republican Party is not acting like a normal political party, that everything has become zero-sum.
Exactly. If the Democrats were to get rid of the filibuster, even partially, they'd have to live by their decision. And they'd have to realize that if they wanted to stop something that the Republicans are building, they'd have to reach across the aisle and find Republicans to go against it. But that, again, is bipartisanship, it seems to me. It's breaking down this kind of lockstep. It's lockstep undemocracy, if you will. That has to try to be broken. But I see the filibuster as making that worse rather than making it better in this abnormal situation. Whereas getting rid of the filibuster actually might make it better.
Well, not to beat up on Republicans here, but why do you, Sean, believe the GOP, whether it's the filibuster or voting rights legislation, seems reluctant to want to widen the tent again, to become a big tent party again? That it seems to want to remain a minoritarian party. At least that's the criticism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes to what we were saying in the last podcast, Martin, about, what the fate of the Republican Party has been. Right now, it seems to me, political parties have natural rhythms. There are times when political parties are full of ideas and full of action and full of activity, and the other parties just aren't. You can see that in my own lifetime. There was a time when the Democratic Party was full of ideas in the 1960s, full of ideas to expand democracy, et cetera. Republicans kind of out of ideas. That changed. The Democrats kind of got exhausted. Their period of vitality came to an end in the 1970s into the 1980s. The Republican Party became the party of action, of ideas, et cetera. Regardless of whether you agree with those ideas or not, the point is that there was action going on there. There's a natural history to that. And I think that the Republican Party is just plain run out of ideas. You're not proposing very much of anything. They are the party of no. And whereas the Democratic Party is starting to get it together, and you see it in the response to COVID, you see it in a number of different ways. Now, given all of that, the Republicans, I think, as you say, have put their money down on a strategy of minority rule. That is to say, they will have a minority of the American population behind them, but they will control the government. And how do you do that? Well, one way to do that is through voting suppression. And that's what I think is going on here, and has been going on really for a fairly long time. But I think that the events of the election in 2020 and the charges that the thing was rigged and stop the steal and all of that have only made it worse. This lie out there that the electorate needs to be constricted, has to be made more difficult to vote rather than easier to vote. That lie has taken on, and it's in Republican state legislatures, that's what's going forward, and it's going to be very, very hard to stop that, except with legislation that's been passed through the House. It's now before the Congress. But that's the strategy that's taken up, and it's a fundamentally anti-democratic one. I mean, in some sense, the Republican Party today, in terms of its strategy for winning, actually resembles the old Democratic Party in the South. I mean, you win by keeping people from voting. And that strategy, worked pretty well for the Jim Crow South, but it wasn't very good for American democracy. It will not end well for the country if that is allowed to go forward.
Sean Wilentz of Princeton. It's been great talking to you again, and next time, I promise, we will take up the Democratic Party's feats and foibles. But on the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll stay with Jim Crow 2.0. Is the wave of voting rights bills in state legislatures the second coming of Jim Crow, one of the most shameful chapters in U.S. history? Eric Foner will join us as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.